406. News Talk 105.9 WMAL. Dan Mandis here, in for Vince Coglianese. Appreciate you listening. You know, we were just talking to Lieutenant Colonel Alan West in the last hour, and I just forget how incredibly dynamic he is. And it was a great wide-ranging conversation. If you missed it, go back and listen to it on the podcast if you would. And one of the things that he constantly was, he must have used the word accountability at least 5 or 6 times in that interview and in talking about the Biden administration and the disastrous pullout of Afghanistan. But, you know, it's fascinating because there's all kinds of topics and issues here in America that do seem to intersect and overlap. I mean, when you talk about accountability, I want you to think about this, and I'm going to try to tie all of this together. So you've got, of course, the pullout of Afghanistan, and we talked about this yesterday, where you track the downfall of Joe Biden, the downfall of his administration, and it really was the start was the pullout of Afghanistan. I mean, that really is where his troubles began. And as you look at his numbers, it's abundantly clear that his administration was never the same. And yes, we did lose 13 members of our military. We did lose thousands of our allies. I mean, you can't really describe the damage that did, not only to America standing on the world stage as well. And so, you know, this is a very big issue, and it will be a big issue heading into 2024. But that really was the beginning of the troubles for Joe Biden and Joe Biden's America. And the question is, who was held accountable? And, you know, Lieutenant Colonel Alan West and I both agree no one was held accountable. Now, when you look at that situation, and then you look at what is going on as we wrapped up the last hour, when you look at what's going on in some of these Democrat-run cities where you have these George Soros paid for, bought and paid for DAs that are soft on crime, bail reform policies. What is the core? What is the crux of those bail reform policies and those George Soros paid for DAs? The core of that is no accountability, no consequences. Somebody walks into a Walmart, or somebody walks into a Home Depot or a Walgreens or whatever, and they just start filling up their basket. They roll in a trash can and they just start throwing a bunch of stuff in there because they know that those George Soros DAs, they won't press any charges. No accountability. Just like in the Biden administration, no accountability. And so then what happens when Americans try to fight back? Then we're the ones that get busted by the police. We're the ones that get prosecuted by the DAs. I mean, the police know exactly what the American people in these cities are going through. But there's nothing they can do because they're having to deal with these DAs, these soft on crime DAs. So again, it's the same thing. No accountability. But who do they want to hold accountable? Donald Trump. And so you have the lawlessness that is happening on the border. You have the lawlessness that is now going on in Afghanistan. You have the lawlessness that's going on in these cities like New York and Chicago and Washington, D.C., and on it goes. And yes, the people of those cities did vote for those Democrats. They did vote for those, what I would say, lack of values, lack of accountability. Sanctuary city status, where they welcome this kind of insanity. They voted for it. They deserve it. But there are some people in those cities that do vote Republican. I don't know if they're still there. Hell, they've probably fled at this point. I know that I would. Are there any Republicans? I'm going to be honest with you because I live in Nashville, Tennessee. I'm filling in for Vince. I host a morning show in Nashville, Tennessee. And there's not a lot of Republicans in Nashville. I'd be willing to bet there's not a lot of actual Republicans that live in, the district. A lot of parts of Virginia, very blue, of course. And I don't know if there's a lot of Republicans left in places like Chicago proper, South Chicago, or, again, a city of New York. I think that they've all fled. Why? No accountability. Again, it goes back to the same thing. But again, who do they want to hold accountable is Donald Trump. And they want to hold him accountable for literally utilizing his freedom of speech. His freedom of speech to question the election, which is his right. So they want to get really tough on Donald Trump for, in my opinion, doing nothing wrong, but doing what he is constitutionally allowed to do. Yet here we are in a lot of these cities across America where the bad guys, the true bad guys, the real bad guys, are not being held accountable. I mean, that's the Democrat Party, pure and simple. Alan Dershowitz told Steve Bannon the whole fiasco of the indictment documents being put up before the grand jury even voted on them proves this whole thing was rubber stamped.
Well, the fact that they were willing to put the indictment on the website before the grand jurors voted proves something that any of us who have had experience in criminal law know. The grand jury is meaningless. There are 23 or whatever number it is chairs that the prosecution moves around. If the prosecutor wants an indictment, she gets an indictment. So nobody should say, oh, my God, a grand jury, 23 people looked at the evidence and they said there was enough to indict. Ignore it. It's nonsense. The grand jury didn't decide anything. They rubber stamped something that the prosecutor put before them. And the best evidence is the prosecutor was so confident she was willing to put it on her website even before the vote took place. It's Alice in Wonderland, verdict first, execution, and then trial.
I mean, anybody who really thinks that this whole thing is on the up and up is sadly mistaken. Or they know that it's not right, but they simply don't care. They want the orange man out of office. Orange man bad, right? They want Donald Trump out of the picture so badly, they are willing to do whatever it takes to do it. This is crooked and it's wrong. And the American people know it. At least the ones that are paying attention. Do you think that most people, I mean, this is Washington, D.C., right? So I would assume, in surrounding areas, but I would assume that most people that are listening to my voice right now on WMAL, everything that's going on with this. And whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, at the very least, you have a fundamental working knowledge of what is going on with the Georgia indictments. But there is a whole swath of people out there that have absolutely no idea what the real perspective is on this. We had a good debate the other night about Donald Trump and will he actually be convicted? And again, I believe that he will because that's how they're playing this game. Others thought the case would just, wilt away under the scrutiny of legal minds and judges and juries and so forth. I mean, we'll have to wait and see what happens. But Alan Dershowitz continues to say that there will be convictions, and their goal is to get those convictions early.
And I predict there'll be some convictions. I think the strategy is to get bad convictions, but to get them fast in New York, in Florida, in Washington, and in Fulton County. Then they'll be reversed on appeal.
Yep.
But they'll be reversed on appeal after the election. That's why everybody's rushing to get these cases tried. We now know that they want it tried within 6 months in Georgia. They want a trial in January in Washington, D.C. They want a trial in May in Florida. New York has been willing to put it off, but they're going to get on the bandwagon too. Everybody who is going after Trump, the whole get Trump approach is to get him before the election, convict him before the election. Then he wins on appeal. All right, that's tomorrow's news.
Well, that's exactly right. I mean, who cares what happens? I would say this. When I say who cares what happens, I'm speaking as the Democrats. They don't care what happens as long as they keep Donald Trump out of office. Here's the other thing. is that you've got, Franny Franny Willis, whatever pronunciation you prefer, and you might say, well, wait a minute, Mandis, she is a district attorney. So why would a DA come up with this indictment that by many accounts is just a house of cards ready to fall? It has no substance, they say. It has no legal merit, they say. It has no constitutional standing, many say. So why would she put her career on the line by producing a document, let alone posting it on the website before it's even voted on by a grand jury? But why would she put out a document so flimsy? Well, it's because the Democrats, they're all in this together. You really don't think that she is an absolute hero to people on the left? You really don't think that if she ran for some other office, even if she, lost this case or whatever, she is now a hero to the left because she is attacking legally Donald Trump? And, we keep hearing this phrase, constitutional crisis. Well, what exactly does that look like? That would be my question. What exactly does that look like? How will it be misused by the prosecutors in this case in Georgia? Well, Alan Dershowitz has a thought.
Constitution permits voters to decide who the president should be through the Electoral College. They don't allocate that responsibility to prosecutors, to jurors, to judges. There are now attempts to try to disqualify, and they'll increase after this indictment, to try to disqualify Trump from running under the 14th Amendment, which says that you can't hold office if you've been involved in an insurrection or a rebellion. The 14th Amendment was intended to cover people who fought in the Civil War. It was not intended to cover future elections 150 or 80 years later. And so what we're seeing is attempts to misuse and weaponize the Constitution for partisan purposes.
Yeah. It's amazing, by the way. Have you noticed that, you got all these people screaming about the 14th Amendment, but nobody seems concerned about the 25th? Have you seen Joe Biden lately? I mean, really? Out there in Milwaukee, we had a lot of fun with that audio yesterday where, we're trying to figure out why can't he figure out how to get off the stage? Why is this so difficult? I mean, it is stunning. It is stunning that every single day Joe Biden leaves the stage. Every single time that Joe Biden leaves the stage, he can't figure out where in the world he's supposed to go. And so when you look at everything that Biden is doing and everything that Biden is saying and everything that Biden is lying about, and there's a lot, it goes back to the original point of this monologue, which is about accountability and who the elite Democrats in Washington, D.C. and across the country, who are they trying to hold accountable? Are they trying to hold the real criminals accountable? No, they're not. They're going after Donald Trump. And about the 25th Amendment, where it is abundantly clear that Joe Biden is suffering from some declining of mental acuity. I'm trying to be nice. Every time I say it, I feel like I'm saying it wrong, but it is abundantly clear that Joe Biden is having mental issues. I mean, that is obvious. But nobody within his cabinet wants to talk about the 25th Amendment. And, of course, that would leave us with Kamala Harris, which brings up a lot of its own problems. By the way, speaking of no accountability, Adam Schiff, of all people, is out there now applauding the decision to televise Donald Trump's trials in Georgia. Adam Schiff was on CNN, and here's part of what he had to say. Again, of all people.
I think that there are still a great many Americans who are going to be very interested to watch these trials, and I'm particularly grateful that in Georgia that trial is likely to be televised. I've been urging the Judicial Conference and led a letter to that conference with dozens of my colleagues urging that the federal proceedings be televised, because I think it's going to be enormously important that those people who have an open mind get to watch, that it's not filtered in one way or another.
Now, remember, he and Nancy Pelosi, the Democrats, they televised that dramatized miniseries about January 6th, where Donald Trump wasn't even really allowed to defend himself at all or have any type of representation. And they had that former TV producer help tell the story. Remember that whole thing? I am all for these being televised, whether it is the Jack Smith special counsel, or even the E. Jean Carroll case, or the case down in Florida, or the case here there in Georgia. I'm all for these things being televised. You know why? Because I think that the vast majority of the American people will watch it, and they will realize that the Democrats are trying to hold the wrong person accountable. There are millions of illegal border crossers that are not being held accountable, that should be held accountable. There are thousands of people across this country in Democrat-run cities that are committing crimes every single day, and they're not being held accountable. The one guy that the Democrats do want to hold accountable is Donald Trump, who has not done a darn thing wrong. Dan Mandis in for Vince Coglianese. Thank you very much for joining us on WMAL. Hey, coming up after the news, John Daniel Davidson. He is the senior editor at the Federalist, and we're going to talk about his column. The purpose of the Trump indictments is to demonstrate the left's power. It's going to be a great talk, and we're going to do that next on WMAL. 4:35 on 105.9 FM WMAL. Dan Mandis here in for Vince Coglianese. Appreciate you being here, and really looking forward to speaking to John Daniel Davidson, senior editor at the Federalist. And John, thank you very much for joining us here on WMAL. I love your new article here in the Federalist. Again, the purpose of the Trump indictments is to demonstrate the left's power. And you say that this isn't about hypocrisy. This is actually about hierarchy. Talk about what's going on in Georgia.
Yeah, that's right. Everybody has rightly noted the hypocrisy in the latest Trump indictment, which is a lot like the earlier Trump indictments, Jack Smith's indictment of Trump for engaging in First Amendment protected free speech. If the things that Trump has done were illegal, then Hillary Clinton should be indicted. Stacey Abrams, as I mentioned, has made a career out of denying that she lost the 2018 governor's race in Georgia. So this isn't about hypocrisy. The hypocrisy is too obvious. It's too laughable. This is about demonstrating the hierarchy at work here, which is that Republicans get indicted and Democrats get off. And there's a hierarchy in this country, and the left is trying to communicate that to Americans. And that's what this is really all about here.
Well, one of the things, and you rightly bring this up, is the things that Donald Trump is being accused of in this indictment, and these things are being called crimes, the American people have done on social media and in conversations with their own lawmakers. I mean, this is something that, as you look at the, as you point out, the rather mundane things that Trump did that are being called crimes and that he could go to jail for, are things that the American people have all done if they're politically active. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's part of the messaging here. The messaging on the left is that if you do these things that Democrats are allowed to do, activists on the left are allowed to do, Hillary Clinton is allowed to do, but if you do them, or if Trump does them, then they amount to a crime, and you're going to get in trouble for that. So they call it racketeering. They call it a criminal conspiracy. But what was the object of the conspiracy? Legal challenges to the election. There's legal challenges to elections all the time. It's nothing new. These were court cases in multiple states that the Trump campaign was pursuing through legal means. And of course, there were phone calls involved in that, and emails, and tweets, and reservations of rooms at the Georgia Capitol for hearings and for organizational meetings. All of that as far as the left is concerned, is a crime if you're a Republican. If you're a Democrat, it's not. And as I said, that's not hypocrisy, that's hierarchy. And we need to understand that.
You know, it is interesting, too, as we talk about all of these things, is that they're trying to make Trump supporters, I believe specifically, clearly, trying to make us feel powerless. You know, when we look at the journey of your average Trump supporter, right? He comes down the escalator, I should say. He announces that he's running for president. He talks about the murderers and the rapists that are coming across our southern border. And, you know, we all knew what he meant in context. But the left went absolutely bat crap crazy. And then it's off to the races. Then you have Russia collusion. You have the Mueller investigation. You have the twice attempts at impeachment. 2 times they tried to impeach him. They've got all of the accusations of Donald Trump. He's Hitler and his followers, air quotes, are Nazis. I mean, this has been not just here in the last couple of weeks with the announcement of the Atlanta indictment, the Fulton County indictments. This has been a 6-year assault on Republicans, and that's, I think, what a lot of Republicans are feeling today. It is a never-ending assault, not only on our desired political candidate, but also our values.
That's right. The real crime that Trump committed was winning the 2016 election. That's the real crime. And the real crime that the American people committed was putting him in office. And the left and the deep state and the permanent regime in Washington want the American people to know that they're not allowed to do that. And they better not try to do that again. And that's why you see the book being thrown at January 6th protesters, even the little grannies who wandered in through the open doors, not knowing what was going on at the Capitol. And yet, at the same time, that same summer, you have Black Lives Matter and Antifa rioters who get off scot-free, in fact, who are encouraged and embedded by Democrat politicians. So the message here is clear. And that message is that you have no power, and we have all the power, and we can bring to heel even someone like a former president like Donald Trump. And if we can do that to him, imagine what we can do to you. That is the message that Americans need to be getting from the left, because that is what the left is trying to tell us.
John Daniel Davidson, senior editor at the Federalist, is with us here on WMAL and the Vince Coglianese Show. And you are so incredibly right. And, you know, one of the things, and I've said this before, one of the things that I talk about often is the Democrats, they've kind of cracked the code, if you will. They now know how to effectively impact either a presidential candidate or a president with constant investigations, constant threats, and impeachments, and now here we are attacking him with indictments for things that clearly, in my opinion, he didn't do anything wrong. And so, I don't know if it stops with Donald Trump. Now that the Democrats know how to do this, I think that the saying, which has been bantied about a lot lately, is, you show me the man, I'll find you the crime. I feel like that's going to be the new mantra for the Democrats, no matter who's running on the Republican side.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I think that as long as the Republican nominee is somebody who isn't controlled opposition, you're going to see the same treatment that Donald Trump got. So anyone who challenges the establishment, anyone who goes against the deep state and the permanent regime in Washington is going to be treated like this. They were after Donald Trump before he ever even won the election in 2016. The Obama administration, CIA, and FBI were hatching this crossfire hurricane investigation against Trump, and it's been political and counterintelligence warfare against Trump since the moment he got the Republican nomination. And the reason for that is that as far as the establishment in Washington is concerned, the American people aren't allowed to elect someone like Donald Trump. We're not allowed to do it. And so they're trying to tell us, you better not do it again. You better not try to do that again. And message received.
Well, then that was going to be my next question, which is, okay, so we know what the message is. I don't know if the message is being received by Republicans the way that the Democrats intend, because it is my contention, and I'm very curious as to what your opinion is on this, but it's my contention that this is angering Republicans. And now, I mean, I've spoken to, I can't tell you how many folks who were just over Donald Trump. I mean, they were done with him. He says stupid stuff on social media. Yeah. He's trying to sell coins. He's shooting himself in the foot and he's shooting off his mouth. We're done. Those same people who turned into from Trump supporters to never Trumpers are now back to Trump supporters because they're just pissed off.
Yeah, that's right. They are making a martyr out of him. And I think people understand the stakes here, because if they allow the left to do this, if they allow the regime to do this, then we're done as a self-governing republic. We will be a shell of a democracy. We'll have all the outward forms of democracy, but we won't really have freedom. We won't really have self-government of the people, by the people, for the people. We'll be like Iran. The regime tells you who you're allowed to vote for, and then they have an election. That's what it'll be in the United States. I think a lot of people get that, and they get that it's not really about Trump. It's about what the left thinks they're allowed to do, how they're allowed to weaponize federal law enforcement agencies, how they're allowed to weaponize the Justice Department and the court system, and destroy the Constitution and take away our freedoms. And I think, I don't know how we get through 2024 with the situation as it is right now. I just don't.
Well, it's interesting.
A lot of people understand the stakes.
I think they do. Here's my question for you, though. You are senior editor at the Federalist, John Daniel Davidson. I'm Dan Mandis. I'm a talk show host. You and I are, you far more than I, but incredibly plugged in to what is going on. Do you think the average American understands that Donald Trump really didn't do anything wrong? Hunter Biden and Joe Biden certainly have done things that are wrong, and they're being protected by the DOJ. You and I are mired in this stuff, but does the average American, the person who just maybe pays attention to the news a couple of weeks before an election, what's the message that they're receiving?
I mean, if they only consume corporate media, then the message they're receiving is the regime message. And that is that Donald Trump is a criminal, and this is just justice being served, and that Biden and his family have never done anything wrong. Because the corporate media is sort of the handmaiden of the regime. They are the propaganda arm of the permanent regime in Washington, and they will defend the regime at all costs. And I think they are counting on the fact that most Americans, or enough Americans, are sort of low information voters who only pay attention in the final weeks of an election, and then they'll just accept what they're fed. But I think they underestimate kind of how digital media has changed how people consume news and what they're aware of, and how much the average person knows. I think at this point the abuses of power and the double standards and the naked wielding of power are so egregious and so blatant and obvious that a lot of people notice it now. You don't have to be a news junkie to know that Biden is crooked. You don't have to be a news junkie to know that there's something weird and fishy and suspect about all these indictments of Trump. I think people get it, and I think that actually gives me a ray of hope.
You know what? And it's great you say that, because I agree with you. There's so many people who, especially in my business, and I actually tend to be one of them at times, where we do talk about, the mainstream media, they're not covering this, but there's a lot of really good conservatives that are on social media, and, they're on, the Federalist, for example. We've got Dan Bongino here on WMAL, who has an incredible podcast and, of course, radio show as well. So, you are right. The mainstream media, they are finding themselves more and more irrelevant. And I think part of the reason for that is because of a changing media landscape. But I also believe that they're finding themselves more and more irrelevant because they've destroyed their own credibility time and time again.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's also part of my take. What say you?
Absolutely. I mean, I don't even use the term mainstream media anymore because it's not actually accurate. They don't represent the mainstream in American life anymore. They represent the left-wing fringe. I mean, the biggest conspiracy theorists in the media are some of the biggest names in cable news. They pushed this Russia collusion hoax when they knew, long after everybody knew, there was nothing to it. It was crazy. And they went on and on about it for years. And the whole purpose was to undermine Trump's presidency and get him impeached. And when that didn't work, they moved on to the next thing. These people are nuts. They're not mainstream. They're fringe. But they do have power, and they do have a lot of money behind them. And that's why I call them the corporate media, not the mainstream media. It's also better to call them, I guess, state media, because that's what they really are.
You know, I think you, John Daniel Davidson, I think you've convinced me to change my vernacular permanently. Now, this is interesting. Listen to this real quick, because I know we got to wrap this up. Latest polls out of Iowa, Donald Trump coming in at 46%, up to Biden coming in at 47%, down to, and also his job approval rating is at negative 16. 39% approval rating, 55% disapproval rating, and it does not look good for independents. Joe Biden is at a net negative 22, 35 approval, 57 disapproval among independents. So I think part of what's going on is the more that people are digesting what's happening, I think, is it a combination? This is your political analysis I'm asking for. Are people are still suffering from the economy, but is the news of, Hunter Biden, Joe Biden, and, influence peddling and bribery, is all of that also starting to seep in now?
I think it is, partly because it's just so egregious. It's impossible for any rational, clear-headed, honest person to deny what Joe Biden was doing and what Hunter Biden was doing for years and years, influence peddling overseas and selling access to Joe Biden as vice president, maybe actually Joe Biden even as president now. It's really hard to come to any other conclusion, even for like ordinary people who don't pay that much attention. And I think that's part of why you're seeing that in the polls. It's that, and it's the other thing you mentioned. People know that the Biden administration is basically failing from an economic perspective. There's no such thing as Bidenomics. It's a nonsense phrase. Inflation is still crushing people, and ordinary Americans are still struggling. So, those things are real. What you see on the news, what you hear from the White House press briefing room, that's not real, and people know that.
Well, real wages are down, and yes, you're right. People are still suffering. We've got like a minute left. Let me ask you, John Daniel Davidson, a senior editor at the Federalist. You got any predictions for what's going to happen here in the next year and a half? I mean, there's so much, and I don't know if you could distill it down to a minute, but, does Donald Trump, does he... I think he's going to win the primary, but what happens in the general? And will Joe Biden even be the nominee for the Democrats?
Man, it's such a crazy time, and there's so many contingencies. So much could happen just in the next 6 months. It's really hard to predict anything. And I also was chastened in 2016 to be very judicious in the future about my predictions. I'm sure a lot of people were. But I tell you, we have big problems in this country, and people also need to realize that the left is going to see this thing through. They are going to want to put Trump in prison. They're going to want to see him in an orange jumpsuit. They want to see his mugshot. They want to gloat over the corpse of his political career. And so people need to brace themselves for that. That's probably going to happen. If I have any prediction, it's that.
And it very well could backfire. John Daniel Davidson, senior editor at the Federalist, thank you very much for joining us. Great conversation, and I hope you have a great afternoon. It's 4:57 on 105.9 WMAL. Dan Mandis here in for Vince Coglianese, and I am a talk show host in Nashville, Tennessee. on Super Talk 99.7 WTN. I host the morning show there, and I'm always glad to fill in on WMAL for Vince. Now, coming up, really looking forward to speaking to Adam Credo after the news at 5, senior writer of foreign policy and national security for the Washington Free Beacon. We're going to talk about reports that the Biden administration decided to give hundreds of millions of dollars in taxpayer aid to the Palestinians. Clearly, that's not good for Israel. We'll talk to Adam about that. Also, there's some big news. I don't know if you heard this story. There is big news about Iran that has just come out here in the last couple of hours. I'll share those details with you next as well, right here on News Talk 105.9 WMAL.